Hi, everybody, and welcome to this question and answer session for OpWall's Situ lecture series. This morning, we're lucky to get to chat with Luke Howard, the project officer at Plan Vivo. I hope you all had a chance to watch his lecture about the voluntary carbon markets, and we got lots of great questions today for Luke to answer about how the voluntary carbon market works. As a reminder, I'm Sophia Wood from Operation Wallacea. If you are watching this on YouTube or Facebook, please feel free to send through any questions throughout the live feed. We'll be checking both the email and the chat on all of these different on YouTube and Facebook. So if you have any questions, feel free to send them to xc2@opwall.com, or you can ask via the chat on YouTube or on Facebook. And if you're watching on the OpWall website and you can't see the chat, just click the YouTube button. It'll take you to the YouTube feed and you can ask a question through there. We'll be checking throughout our talk this morning, so feel free to send any questions as they come up. Thanks so much for joining us this morning, Luke.
No problem. I'm happy to help and be here, as you know, since I've been on Operation Wallacea before.
Of course. Well, I really enjoyed your talk. I think the voluntary carbon market is such an interesting niche of the conservation field that I think a lot of people wouldn't have necessarily thought of before. And it's certainly obviously something we've worked on with OpWall. So, you know, I think it's great that you had a chance to talk to students a little bit more about it and kind of open up this new field of conservation to talk to people. So we got a lot of questions about how the voluntary carbon market works, which might be a sign that it's maybe complicated, but it's a really interesting subject. So I guess to get started, I'd love to hear kind of, you were a student with OpWall in Indonesia, and then you got a master's and continue to work in conservation. So how did working with OpWall kind of help you lead into your current work?
I think, yeah, I did OpWall when I was in the first year of my undergraduate degree. I think it just kind of gave me a better idea of, is this exactly the type of area that I want to go into? At the time, during my undergraduate, I completed a few different, I knew I liked biology, and I knew conservation. Parts of me thought maybe I liked lab work, parts of me thought maybe I liked the actual conservation work. OpWall itself, it told me that I really liked the type of work that's going on, but I couldn't really see myself in that type of exact role, going out there all the time in the field. And I think I prefer maybe an office job that maybe had a bit of traveling or something like that, so I could see this every now and then. So, and I think it's great if you're anything like myself, who I had no idea what I was going to do for years, having the opportunity to finally tick something in your head that says, yes, I want to go down that route, or no, I don't want to go down that route. It really helps and puts your mind at ease. So yeah, it really did help me kind of figure out that I wanted to go further into the conservation route.
Awesome. Well, so now you work obviously at Plan Vivo, which is, you know, one of the major bodies working in voluntary carbon markets. So there's a lot of players and standards in the voluntary carbon market, it sounds like. And you kind of talked about this in your talk. Do you feel like there should be a single body looking after the entire carbon market, or is it good to have kind of various competitors and registries out there?
I definitely think that the voluntary carbon market and having all these different standards is a benefit. The fact that there are kind of all these different standards and some can come and go is what kind of makes it voluntary. If it was all hosted by one organization, then you're kind of coming more to what the compliance market is. The compliance market's like Kyoto Protocol, the Clean Development Mechanism, and your EU ETS scheme. The problem with the compliance markets is the bureaucratic side of it. So, like the Clean Development Mechanism was set up. I can't remember the year. A long time ago, and it took a long time to get going and became very bureaucratic, with all the countries trying to feed in their what they think is best, what they think how these projects should run. This slowed down it being operated and made the requirements for projects to get onto the CDM. It made it very difficult to access, made it very expensive, and which kind of stifled the amount of projects, or the amount of certain types of projects. they're having kind of the competition, almost like a free market of all these standards within the VCM, has allowed innovation. It's allowed experimentation. The first carbon credits were on the voluntary carbon market. They were ours, and that's what kind of got a lot of things going. But
Sure.
the idea, like I think the first registries were voluntary carbon market as well. I'm not 100% sure on that, but also the ideas of trying to quantify other benefits of other than carbon. That's also the voluntary carbon market that's toying around with that. So it also means that you can have standards that kind of meet for different buyers. So
Okay.
you can have some standards that put a large amount of requirements on their projects, a large amount of sureties, and this drives up the cost for the project. So not everyone, it's not accessible for everyone, but some buyers who want to absolutely minimize risk prefer those types of standards. While other standards can be a bit more relaxed, a bit more flexible, reduce the cost for those on the ground, and then that means we can get more projects in to those standards. So having this kind of free market approach allows competition, drives innovation, but also allows for a variety of types of projects and standards.
Right. That makes a lot of sense. I mean, obviously, it's a massive market, and I would imagine that having that competition means that also you're pushing companies to think of new ways to develop these carbon credits. And like you guys are working with, smallholder farmers, not everyone is doing that. So I wanted to ask kind of about the choice to work with smallholder farmers and local communities, because that was obviously a big theme in your talk. And I was wondering if you get any pushback from communities when you're asking them to stop doing traditional or cultural practices around how they manage their land, and also just kind of what it looks like to ask a community to move into a different kind of agroforestry.
Yeah, I can't comment a huge amount just because I'm not a project developer myself. I can only kind of talk about what I've heard
Sure.
from projects and people. That there's a huge network in this sector, and you get to meet a lot of people, and you hear all their stories. But generally, organisations that start these carbon projects, they've already been working on the ground with these communities for years and years. It takes a lot of time to build trust. And for example, there's a lot of fear in some places that if you plant a tree, this was from a conversation I was having with someone who was talking about a project in Peru. If you plant a tree, if you go in and say that you want to be planting trees, the locals often think, well, they're going to try and take my land. They think of these gingros coming over, and somehow they're going to take advantage of the locals. So
Yeah.
it takes a long time to try and get that trust that they will believe that this is a cooperative thing. This is a partnership. This is beneficial for both of us. And then once the project's got going, often it happens on a small pilot area. And if it is successful, which it nearly always is, then it helps to spread because others can actually see the benefits. They can actually see how it works rather than just being promised this is what will happen in the future. You can actually see this is what's already happening to your neighbours. Would you like to kind of join in? And the word of mouth kind of spreads and they get more attention. But I mean, at the end of the day, if they don't want to join, then they don't want to join. You can't force them to do this. The whole point of this is that that locals are involved in creating the projects and they sign up with free, prior, and informed consent. You can't force someone into this from a top-down approach.
Absolutely. And that kind of leads into this question we received about your project in New Zealand, which was the only developed country where you're working. You mentioned because it's run, I assume, by an indigenous community in a Maori community in New Zealand. So why don't you do more work in developed countries?
Yeah, no, it's a good question, and it's actually something that we kind of discussed a bit more in our stakeholder meeting in October. Like our primary goal has, I mean, we originally came from developed communities. Our first project was in Chiapas in Mexico in 1994.
Right.
And that was developing country, and we kind of made our goal to help people who were in poverty and they're kind of most affected by the climate crisis. Now that kind of criteria easily fits a lot of communities in developing countries. But we do admit and recognise that poverty is relative. You can get poverty in developed countries,
Of course.
and like for example, like in Canada, you can also get like tribes and things like that that are across vast spans ranges of land. So I mean, we took a decision recently that we will allow projects from developed countries. They don't have to technically necessarily be tribal or natives, as long as they kind of can justify that they're in this kind of poverty criteria, and that this project will be of a benefit to them. But we're yet to have a project apply that meets this criteria. I think because another thing that's to consider though as well is that at the moment our requirements are that land must be either communal land, which it's for people who are in developed countries, there's not much community land about. It's all privately owned land, and the other type of land is privately owned, but it needs to be a lot of privately owned. It needs to be like the developed world's smallholders, and again, that's not very common. And I mean, the most common version is gardens, but it's going to be harder in some countries like the UK to convince people to plant trees in their gardens for carbon credits and for producing fruit or timber, etc. So there are some barriers, but it is something we will allow. I think it's just kind of harder to hit that criteria. But if we can, then great. We'd happily accept those projects.
Right, that makes sense. I mean, obviously, I would assume that trees might grow a little bit slower as well as the farther north or south that you get, farther from the tropics.
Yeah, well, that's something that needs to be taken into consideration when you kind of calculating what the carbon benefits are going to be, and it might be a reason why the project's less. It might reduce the incentive for people to get involved because your trees aren't going to grow as fast as these other projects have been doing. But that's up to the project to weigh up.
That makes sense. Well, speaking of that, I think this is probably a hard question, but one of the questions is kind of how can we scale up the voluntary carbon market so it's including more stakeholders, probably more companies trying to go carbon neutral. Obviously, the world is kind of heading towards that. We're seeing big companies like Microsoft, making carbon neutrality claims or promises for the future, and it's likely to continue. So how do you envision that this market can scale up and benefit more communities and also help more companies, become carbon neutral?
Yeah. It's important. It's something like scaling up, something we've like kind of been really trying to focus on recently. There's two different sides to it. It's trying to increase demand from the buyers, from companies and individuals, and trying to increase and trying to bring in more projects, increase the supply. On the demand side of things, I think we're already on our way to starting to really scale up demand. Demand has kind of gone through the roof in the past few years as people and the public have really got to understand the climate crisis and really got engaged, as I'm sure everyone's aware, with climate strikes, etc. And I think ways it can be pushed further is, as a consumer, try and encourage and support those companies that are already taking these steps, because that will encourage more companies to go down this route if they see that that's what's driving the demand, driving the sales of their products. I think, as a note though, I think companies have to be careful how they go down this route, because I've seen some companies just say they're going to plant this. They made like a 3-page document saying they're going to plant 100 hectare of trees. Each tree on average is about this much carbon. Therefore, this is how much carbon we're going to sequester, and therefore we're carbon neutral. And that's not how that's not a good way to do it. So they have to go through the correct channels to achieve this. And there's tons of consultancy organizations to help that. But in terms of the the supply side, trying to get more projects involved and trying to scale up those projects. I mean, firstly, I think trying to reduce the cost on projects. Cost is obviously a barrier. If you reduce that barrier, you're going to get more projects involved. How can you do that? Hopefully, technological solutions can help out, sharing of knowledge. And hopefully the idea that as the sector grows, things generally get cheaper because processes, there's more competition going on, services can be offered cheaper, etc. And I mean, hopefully also the increase in demand is going to cause a new surge in interest. I mean, it definitely has from our side. We can see many more projects coming to us saying, how can we try and get carbon credits as well? And that's really great. Obviously, not all of them can do it. They have to meet certain criteria, but we've seen an increase in projects coming forward saying that they want to get involved in this because they can see the revenue that it provides to the coordinating organisation and the people on the ground. So I think it will. I think it's definitely expanding. We just need to take steps to try and make it expand faster because it's a crisis, the climate crisis, and we always have to be trying to aim higher than we currently are achieving to try and maximise our response.
So I was going to ask about the requirements because I remember in your talk you mentioned kind of a 20-page document, then a 100-page document in terms of actually getting certified. So it seems like that already, obviously for a rural community, would be a major barrier to entry. But usually I would assume that they're working with a company that has more experience doing that kind of thing. So are there ways to lower these barriers to entry through technology? I know you were mentioning some technological solutions close to the end of your talk. So I'm wondering if there's any kind of ways that we're moving forward to try to make it easier for group or communities to get on board without obviously sacrificing the quality of the carbon credits that we're putting out there.
Yeah, I think two different types of technology. One, in terms of carbon quantification, if you can get software that's almost like a piece of software that's easy to put in, okay, this is my area of land, this is where I live, this is what the soil's like.
Sure.
And these are the trees that I'll be planting. What's the carbon benefit going to be? Like, here's all my management. It was like a plug in what you're going to do, and it would give out what the carbon benefits are going to be. If you could have something like that, that would be a cost saving because you don't have to hire a consultant to create models for you because the model's much more easily accessible. It's all automated. And then the other one is, like I provided in my talk, was around monitoring. If you can reduce the cost of monitoring, which is a long-term one that all has to be factored into the budget of the project, by having, and if you can reduce it by like having satellite data that monitors instead of you on the ground having to pay for locals on the ground to go around and monitor the trees physically, then that would be a huge cost saving as well. And yeah, anything we can do to try and reduce the costs on the projects, as you say, is important because just from what you were saying, it is a big hurdle. That registration process is costly and is a big hurdle. And the two ways in which it's normally done, firstly, if it's just an indigenous group on the ground, often they have some sort of academic expert that's helping them out.
Right.
So just that we have a project in Mongolia that the coordinating organization is just the community. Wow. And then the technical expertise is provided by someone at the University of Leicester. And then it's either that or it's an organization, like a proper organization that already exists, and they're just putting a bit of money into this to help get over that hurdle. But usually most instances they apply for grant applications, funding from, say, the EU or the World Bank or someone to get to that carbon certification point. Because once you've got the carbon credits, it can be more self-sufficient. It's just getting over that hurdle.
Right. So I guess that kind of leads into this question about the ex-ante selling versus ex-post, I think was the other one.
Yeah.
So is there any risk to a program that's selling these carbon credits ex-ante? For example, if they don't achieve the level of credits that we assumed that they were going to achieve? I know you talked about being conservative, but what if, obviously there's kind of a lot of doubts, I guess, or objections to this model, or potential objections. So if that carbon doesn't get sequestered, or those trees actually don't grow in the way that they were predicted to, how does that work in the system?
Yeah, no, it's a fair point, and it's one that gets brought up a lot, and it's one that we try to account for. We each standard, we're not alone. All the standards have this. They all have buffer accounts. So the buffer account, think of it almost like an insurance fund. So a project is expected to put about 20% of the credits that it will ever that it issues, that it gains into this buffer account, which we manage, Plan Vivo manages. And if there's an event of, let's say, a fire, large cutting down of trees, or flood, or pests, anything where the carbon benefits that were promised did not actually happen, then we cancel credits on this account to ensure that those credits that have been sold to companies still then do exist. We've only had one cancellation event so far that was due to some pests on one area farmers. And fingers crossed, I mean, projects take steps to try and prevent these types of things happening. Fingers crossed, we're not going to see anything like that again soon. But if it's kind of on a small localized basis, like one farmer cuts down a tree or decides they don't want to be in the program anymore, then often, and so this is specific to tree planting projects.
Yep.
Often the project will then try and replant those trees by recruiting another farmer. Often they're trying to expand anyway, so those that have left just kind of get absorbed by those that join. So it does all balance out. These are kind of like all accounting things that we have to audit, by us, the Secretariat, but also by the auditors when they have a verification event to ensure that, yes, that's actually true and on the ground. But it's a fair question though.
So when you're managing one of these carbon projects, are you also using a third-party auditor, or are Plan Vivo used as the third-party auditor for these other companies?
So both, in a way. We're not so much an auditor, it's just we complete, every year project will provide us with an annual report, and the annual report will describe everything. They're all on our website. We release them to the public after we've assessed them.
Fantastic.
And within the annual report, it says everything that's gone on the year, any challenges. They also provide a snapshot of their database that says who's come to the project, how much land they've planted, what they're planting. And then you follow that through, make sure the calculations are correct, and then it tells you how much carbon how many carbon credits they should get because they've either expanded, or maybe if it's a conservation area, just because the trees are growing and they're conserving. Trees are growing and they're sequestering carbon.
Sure.
So I mean, that you can count that as like a soft audit from our end, but the main audits happen once every 5 years, where someone other than us, other than Plan Vivo, and an official auditing company goes on the ground to check that everything that they've been telling us is correct,
Right.
and the trees are still there. And if they calculate and try and quantify how much carbon is it within all these trees, then they will get a value that is at or below what they've been that project has been claiming. So it has got its checks and balances in place. If at that point we find out that they've not got as much carbon as they said, then we would use the buffer account again. Then that can cover any shortfall.
That makes sense. And kind of on the same topic of monitoring, you mentioned that there's this big question of how long to monitor these projects, because obviously trees could get cut down 60 years from now, 100 years from now, and that would obviously eventually potentially put the carbon back into the atmosphere. So how long do these projects run in general?
So they vary quite a lot. So the project period itself, which is kind of the period where they're actually actively engaging with the smallholders, with the people on the ground, they vary between 10 years and 40 years. Okay. I'd say most around 25 years though. And that's, it's supposed to be the period where, after the project period is ended, let's say if it is planting trees, after that the trees are very much mature. They are very much they've got past the establishment period, and there's therefore an incentive to keep them, because there's not much effort in keeping them there longer, but the gains are quite high because this is an investment, and this tree will grow and grow and grow, and it's almost like a savings account. But if I say it's like 10 to 40 years or 25 years, but if it's a tree planting project that expands, every time they recruit some little farmers, that takes over. So the new farmers you brought in, you're going to be working with them for 25 years. If you bring someone in next year, you've got to work with them for 25 years. So in a way, they also kind of indefinitely expand, and they then for run indefinitely. That's not the case for all projects. But for those types of tree planting projects, every time they expand, they just prolong how long the project's going to be working for, which is quite. I think it's quite cool.
Yeah, very cool. I hadn't thought about that. That's a good point. Well, so we have about 5 minutes left. So for any of you who are watching on live, please feel free to send in any last questions for Luke. Obviously, if you send them in after, we can always email him. But if you have any burning questions, ask Luke right now. We have a few more minutes with him as we're wrapping things up. So feel free to send any of those through the chat or to xc2@opwald.com. So one thing I wanted to ask you, Luke, as we're wrapping up here is kind of if you could change anything about the voluntary carbon market, what would it be?
It's a tough question. I'd say potentially some greater transparency within some of the standards. Standards are inherently transparent, but I think that they can be more. Information can be better accessed about project documentation or what's been going on the projects on the ground. I think we're very transparent, one of the more transparent standards, but I think across the board that needs to become a bit more of a thing. I don't know if it's something to change right now, but I think it's something good to think about. Is as this sector is growing and has gained more interest and more buyers are coming in, these buyers come from all walks of life, including some people that grassroots conservationists might not be as keen about. So you're talking about, I don't know, Shell, BP, like oil majors, or maybe companies that pollute a lot.
Yep.
What should we have requirements around who we sell our credits to? I think that's a tough one. I don't think we have an answer. It's something we're talking about internally. I know no standard at the moment restricts who they sell their credits to. Some resellers restrict who they sell their credits to. They have to sell to people who have good intentions, who aren't greenwashing. Right. But it's just something good to think about. And I think there's a bit of a scramble at the moment about how to address this, because it is, like I say, this sudden interest has kind of come out of nowhere. So you need to know how to respond to it.
Sure. That's a great point. Well, I think kind of we'll wrap up with a question, brings us a little bit back to the beginning, but it's a question I like to ask just because I think a lot of the people watching this appreciate the advice. So what advice do you have for someone who's looking to get started in a conservation career and maybe doesn't know what exactly they want to do?
Yeah, no, that's I kind of panicked about what I was going to do. Like I knew I wanted to go into biology. I always kept leaning towards conservation, and I panicked about what I wanted to do from my GCSEs, which is like beginning of high school, all the way up into my masters, which was 2 years ago. I think two things you can do. One is experience. I did experience in a lab and realized that was exactly not what I wanted to do. So that was a very easy close off the doors on that type of route. Otherwise, I mean, maybe also I did a very academic undergraduate degree, which didn't really give me a flavour much of what's out there. It just kind of it taught me to be a scientist more than anything. Okay. I then personally went to do a master's that was more practical, gave me a bit of a flavour of what was out there, and did more stuff that maybe consultants would do. So that was good. But at the end of the day, I'd say try not to panic too much about this, because it may seem like there aren't many jobs out there in the conservation sector, but that's not entirely the case. There are lots of jobs out there. There are thousands of small organizations, charities, conservation groups who only have a small amount of staff and only have a small amount of jobs. So often they don't advertise these jobs. So right. They usually recruit kind of based on, I don't know, who they know or who they've been in contact with and things like that, and down the grapevine. And I would say that means that you could end up in a job that you didn't know existed, a niche that you didn't know existed. And like I didn't know that the voluntary carbon, well, I knew a bit about the voluntary carbon market, but not as much. And I ended up getting this job pretty much by chance. But I think, but I'm very happy that I did, and I think it will help set me up for kind of if I wanted to shift something else in the future, then it will. Like once you kind of, I think in the sector, it can help you kind of move about if you ever needed to. So
You need to get that foot in the door.
yeah, it's that. Yeah, it's the foot in the door thing. I always hated that saying though, because I was always like, well, I need to get my foot in there. How do you actually do it?
You did it.
Yeah.
So we actually had another question come in just under the wire. So I'll ask you, and then we'll kind of close things out.
Yeah, sure.
So we got a question that says, I read a study suggesting that young forestry sequesters carbon dioxide more quickly than established mature forestry. So how many years does a forest, or how old does a forest need to be classed as young forest?
I mean, I'm not a forester myself. I'm trying to think back to my like forestry modules, but I would say that, I mean, it depends on the region. Tropical forests, I think, they grow incredibly quick, and I guess they could be considered young forest up until, I don't know, maybe like 20 years. But unlike our projects normally quantify carbon credits for, say, like 50 years or so, or actually it's often around 25, but it's never more than, at the moment, more than 50 years. And they're saying that if the tree is going to grow for 50 years in my model, and this is the amount of carbon we will accept.
Sure.
But in reality, those trees are going to keep growing after 50 years. They'll grow at a slower rate, but they're going to keep growing until they become mature. And then as these projects are only quantifying the carbon really in the trees. Some do it in the soil, but not as much. But as it gets mature, you can imagine everything else that's going in there. You've not just got the tree trunk anymore and the roots. You've got all the soil. You've got all the other vegetation that comes in and alongside the trees. So I think it'd be good if they could access that type of carbon as well. But I think there's a danger about going too far into the future. If you promise too much, like the further you go, it's more of a burden. It's more of a promise that the community has to give, and that can get dangerous. You can't commit a community for like 400 years worth of looking after these trees. So it's a trade-off, and it's an interesting one to kind of weigh about and discuss.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much for your time, Luke. Really appreciate you coming on, obviously, to give the lecture, but also to come on and answer these questions. Are there any social media accounts or websites or anything that you want to shout out that people should follow to keep track of you or Plan Vivo?
Yeah. I'd say, well, we have a Facebook page. I think it's just called Plan Vivo. The same with our Twitter. But I'd say if you really want to kind of have a look at the projects specifically. If you go on our website under projects, you can see all the different ones based on the geographic region. And they've all got accounts as well. And it's good to, I'd say, good to see maybe what you like and see if there's any that are really active you can kind of get involved with, because they give a good idea of what it's like to work on the ground, what the communities get up to and things like that. So yeah, I'd encourage that.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for your time. It was great to chat with you this morning. And thank you to everybody who tuned in live and everyone who's watching this afterward. Really appreciate you guys tuning in for this Situ Q&A.
Yeah, no, thank you for having me. And yeah, thank you everyone for tuning in, and I hope you enjoyed it.
Bye.
Bye.